Here is a fact that feels wrong the first time you hear it. Every major war the United States has fought since 1900, every single one, ended with the American economy measurably larger than when the first shot was fired. Not occasionally, not mostly, every time. That is 124 years of a pattern that has never broken. This is not a coincidence, and it is not propaganda. It is a structural feature of how wars are financed, fought, and recovered from, at least when one nation holds enough industrial capacity, enough geographic distance, and enough credit to convert destruction abroad into production at home. The United States held all three advantages simultaneously, again and again. Today, we are going to walk through 5 wars with real numbers and named sources. And then we are going to look at 2026, where the United States is managing the most expensive simultaneous conflict portfolio in its history, while carrying $35 trillion in debt and a 6.4% deficit. The math that made past wars accretive may not survive this configuration. War 1, April 1917. The United States enters the First World War with an economy that is already industrializing fast, but still seen globally as a regional power. By November 1918, 19 months later, that perception has been permanently revised. The mechanism was credit. Specifically, who was lending to whom at the moment the shooting started. Before the war, Britain and France were financing their own military buildup from London. When the fighting began, they needed external capital fast. The United States extended $10.3 billion in war loans to the Allied powers, equivalent to roughly $230 billion in today's dollars. That single decision transformed America from a debtor nation into the world's largest creditor. American industrial capacity quadrupled between 1914 and 1918, driven by wartime production contracts. Steel output, shipbuilding, chemical manufacturing, all expanded at rates the peacetime economy had never seen. The Council on Foreign Relations documents this shift in detail. American exports to Europe surged 300% in the war years alone. The war created demand that the American factory floor was uniquely positioned to fill. The long-term consequence of World War I's financial architecture was even more significant than the immediate industrial boom. By the time Bretton Woods was signed in 1944, the dollar had quietly replaced the British pound as the dominant currency in international trade settlements. That transition, from pound to dollar, was made possible by the creditor position the United States built between 1917 and 1918. World War I planted the seed for the dollar's reserve status. War II, December 1941. The United States enters World War II with an economy still recovering from the Great Depression. GDP stands at $103 billion. Unemployment is at 14%, not the catastrophic 25% of 1933, but still historically brutal. The war transforms those numbers in ways that no peacetime policy had managed to achieve in 12 years of trying. According to IMF historical GDP data, American gross domestic product doubled from $103 billion in 1941 to $223 billion by 1945. Unemployment collapsed from 14% to 1.2%, effectively full employment. Women entered industrial manufacturing at scale. Assembly lines ran 24 hours, and the federal government became the largest single purchaser in the economy almost overnight. But the most consequential economic output of World War II was not the factories or the employment figures. It was the Manhattan Project. $2 billion invested, about $30 billion in today's money, produced not just a weapon, but an entire research infrastructure, national laboratories, university physics departments, materials science, computing theory. The post-war technology base of the United States was incubated inside wartime federal spending. War 3, June 1950. North Korea crosses the 38th parallel, and within days, the United States is involved in a conflict that will last 3 years and cost $67 billion, about $700 billion in 2024 terms. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War. Economically, it is anything but forgettable. It is the war that made American military spending a permanent structural feature of peacetime. Before Korea, the assumption in Washington was that military spending would fall sharply after any conflict ended, as it had after both world wars. Korea changed that assumption permanently. Military budgets stayed elevated even after the armistice in 1953. The defense industrial complex, the network of contractors, suppliers, research labs, and military bases, became a self-sustaining economic ecosystem that did not shrink when the fighting stopped. That ecosystem had a specific industrial winner: aerospace. According to Congressional Budget Office historical records, the American aerospace sector tripled in size between 1950 and 1960. Jet engine manufacturing, radar systems, and early missile guidance technology, all developed under Korean-era and post-Korean defense contracts, became the foundation for commercial aviation and eventually the satellite industry. The passenger jet you fly today has a direct supply chain lineage to Korean War procurement. Dwight Eisenhower, in his January 1961 farewell address, gave this phenomenon its name. He warned explicitly that the conjunction of a large military establishment and a permanent arms industry represented a new kind of influence in American life, influence the nation had never known before. He called it the military-industrial complex. He was not warning against defense spending. He was warning that the economy had structurally rewired itself around it. War 4, 1964 to 1975. Vietnam. The fiscal cost, according to Watson Institute costs of war project calculations, was $843 billion in 2024 terms. It is the first American war since 1900, where the economic legacy was deeply ambiguous, politically divisive, inflationary, partly responsible for Nixon closing the gold window in 1971. And yet, Vietnam also accidentally funded some of the most consequential technology in human history. In 1969, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, activated ARPANET, a network designed to maintain military communications even if Soviet strikes destroyed centralized infrastructure. 4 nodes: UCLA, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, University of Utah. That network's architecture, distributed, redundant, protocol-based, became the direct structural ancestor of the Internet. The Vietnam-era defense budget funded the communication infrastructure that would generate trillions in economic value over the next half-century. Vietnam also accelerated jet engine refinements that made commercial air travel economically viable for the middle class. And the sheer volume of transistor-based military instrumentation created demand curves that pulled microprocessor manufacturing costs down faster than any pure commercial market could have done alone. The tragedy of Vietnam. The war and the productivity of Vietnam, the technology incubator, coexisted in the same budget lines. The ledger is genuinely complicated. War 5. September 2001. Within weeks of the attacks on New York and Washington, Congress authorizes military operations that will eventually expand across Afghanistan, Iraq, and 17 other countries. The Watson Institute, Costs of War Project at Brown University, the most comprehensive academic accounting of this spending, puts the total cost of the post-September 11th wars at $8 trillion through 2021. 8 trillion. $8 trillion is a number that resists intuition. To give it scale, it is approximately the combined GDP of Germany and Japan for a single year. And yet, that spending seeded several industries that now generate significant portions of American economic output. The mechanism was the same as it had been in prior wars. Federal procurement creating demand that pulled nascent technologies to commercial viability faster than private markets could have managed alone. The most visible commercial spin-off is the drone industry. Military-grade unmanned aerial vehicle technology, developed extensively in Afghanistan and Iraq for surveillance and targeted operations, has become the commercial drone sector, now a multi-billion-dollar industry used in agriculture, film, delivery logistics, and infrastructure inspection. The FAA registered over 800,000 drones in the United States by 2023. The design heritage traces directly to post-September 11th defense contracts. GPS is a second example. The Global Positioning System was a military project, fully operational for defense use by 1995. The post-September 11th military expansion accelerated civilian GPS chip manufacturing and drove costs down from thousands of dollars per unit to under $1 by the early 2010s. Every navigation app, every food delivery platform, every ride-sharing service runs on infrastructure whose cost curve was bent by military procurement volume. That economic value is not counted in the war's price tag. Biometric identity technology, fingerprint scanning, iris recognition, facial geometry was scaled massively in Iraq and Afghanistan to manage civilian population databases and border security. That same technology stack now sits inside every smartphone unlock screen, every airport immigration lane, and the identity verification layers of every major financial institution. The surveillance architecture built for Kandahar and Fallujah became Silicon Valley's authentication infrastructure. So the pattern across 5 wars is consistent. The United States enters a conflict with existing industrial slack. Federal spending, funded by deficit borrowing at accessible rates, creates demand that overloads that slack and forces capacity expansion. New technologies are developed under procurement pressure. When the war ends, those technologies and industries persist into the peacetime economy, generating returns that outpace the original borrowing cost. That is the structural mechanism. 5 times in a row. Now we arrive at 2026, and the question is whether that mechanism still functions when its 3 core preconditions, industrial slack, cheap borrowing, and a dominant post-war trade position, are all simultaneously compromised. Because for the first time since 1900, all 3 preconditions are strained at once. Let us look at what the United States is currently financing. Ukraine, $175 billion authorized by Congress since 2022. Israel, $14 billion in security assistance since October 2023, with ongoing commitments. Indo-Pacific posturing and Taiwan deterrence, $9.1 billion in the most recent defense authorization. Red Sea naval operations against Houthi forces, exceeding $1 billion per month in munitions and operational costs alone, according to Congressional Budget Office reporting. Beneath the direct conflict spending runs a slower and more structurally significant cost. The economic Cold War with China across semiconductors and rare earth materials. Export controls on advanced chips, restrictions on Chinese technology investment, reshoring subsidies through the CHIPS Act. All of these represent a form of deterrence spending that does not appear on the defense budget, but measurably constrains trade flows and supply chain efficiency. The Council on Foreign Relations estimates these frictions cost the U.S. economy tens of billions annually in foregone efficiency. Here is the fiscal context for all of this. The Congressional Budget Office projects the U.S. federal deficit at 6.4% of GDP in 2026. Total national debt sits at $35 trillion. Interest payments on that debt now exceed the entire defense budget for the first time in American history, over $800 billion annually. In every prior war, the United States borrowed when rates were low and repaid into post-war growth. Today, the borrowing is occurring at 4.5 to 5% interest rates, with no clear post-war growth windfall in sight. The third structural precondition, post-war trade dominance, also looks different in 2026. In prior conflicts, the United States emerged as the primary supplier to reconstruction economies. Today, China is the primary trading partner of more than 130 countries. The petrodollar's grip has loosened with BRICS nations conducting an increasing share of oil trades in non-dollar currencies. The IMF's own data shows the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 71% in 2000 to under 59% in 2024. The post-war trade windfall that historically repaid American war debt is no longer structurally guaranteed. So how will we know if the pattern is actually breaking? There are three specific indicators worth watching. The first is Treasury auction tail size, the difference between the yield the market demands and the yield the Treasury hope to pay. When tails widen, it means buyers are becoming more reluctant. The second indicator is foreign holdings of U.S. debt as a percentage of GDP. If that number declines sharply, it signals that the world's appetite for financing American deficits is contracting. The third indicator is the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves. That IMF number we just looked at. If it falls below 55% within the next 3 years, the structural logic that allowed the United States to borrow cheaply, win expensively, and grow afterward will face its most serious test since 1944. 5 wars built the American economy. The question now is whether a portfolio of simultaneous deterrences on borrowed money against a changed world order continues that pattern or ends it. Which of the 5 wars surprised you most with how much it built? And do you think the current portfolio breaks the streak? Leave one of the 5 names below. I am tracking the responses to see which conflict viewers actually remember.